Okay, so hi everybody. I am Sarah Vose. I'm the State Toxicologist here at the Health Department. I'm excited to be giving a presentation. I do miss presenting. COVID was quite a challenge to get presentations up and running, so I'm happy to be sharing some information with you all today. I am going to turn off my video so that I don't distract myself. And just a little bit about my background. I have a Ph.D. in molecular toxicology. I studied pesticide neurotoxicity, so looking at different markers of neurotoxicity in the blood and correlating those to symptoms that were appearing in children who were heavily exposed to pesticides. That was at UC Berkeley. I did my postdoc work at Harvard School of Public Health, and I switched fields and I studied DNA repair and premature aging. This was in a very rare disease called Cockayne syndrome. So I used a mouse model to try to figure out why missing one of the DNA repair pathways resulted in this premature aging phenotype. I'm telling you all this so that you believe me when I tell you that there is absolutely no medical advice in this presentation. So please be mindful of that. So just a quick outline of my talk so that you know where we're going. I pulled together some data, and I definitely need to give credit to the folks who provided this data. But I looked at some data from the Northern New England Poison Center. You know, they take calls from folks who have concerns about chemical exposures, and they sent me some data for the past few years on what types of phone calls they get. And then I also pulled some data from the Vermont EMS system. So this should be really directly related to some of the calls that you folks are getting. So I'll review some of the common contaminants and common chemicals that are reported. And then there's a few others that I'll highlight. I do want to go over some more in-depth information about pesticide toxicology. I think pesticides are a pretty, well, they're chemicals that are meant to kill things, and we are also living things. So there's a lot of overlap between how plants and animals react to pesticides and how humans react. And then I'll close out with a couple of summaries of some of the bigger chemical incidents that the health department and others have been involved in here in Vermont. As I'm going through this, feel free to put in the chat. You know, I don't know if your favorite toxicant or poison is the right way to think of it, but if there's a particular chemical that you've always wondered about or that you've seen quite a lot, feel free to pop it in the chat. The way that I'm screen sharing, I don't actually see the chat, but I think the organizers, feel free to stop me at any time if you see a question pop up. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. Okay, so this is the first data set. This is from the Northern New England Poison Center. I think I had one extra C in my previous slide for an acronym. But as I said, they take phone calls from people, and this is a summary of the different categories that they received calls about from 2017 to 2021. Hopefully this isn't showing up too small for you guys. I know there's a lot of colors on this slide. The biggest category of substances that people called about were cosmetics and personal care products. I'm going to dive into some of these top call categories in the next several slides. They also got a lot of calls about cleaning substances. That's that second bar there. So both of those were roughly 1,800 calls or incidents over the past few years. There were calls about foreign bodies or toys, miscellaneous. That data wasn't especially informative. But plants are a popular call topic. I mean, we know there are lots of plants that can be harmful. The rest of the categories are not super surprising. Alcohols, pesticides, fumes, gases, vapors, and chemicals. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these. So this is that first category of calls. It was cosmetics and personal care products. And the biggest portion of the pie there, that little blue section, is ethanol-based hand sanitizers. So that's probably not surprising to many people. We know that ethanol can be pretty toxic when ethanol is consumed faster than it can be metabolized. You end up with a lot of ethanol itself and ethanol metabolites in the bloodstream. A common theme that you'll hear me repeat this a few times, is that children can be especially vulnerable. This is true for ethanol. So despite children consuming what may appear to be a pretty small amount of ethanol, they can develop pretty concerning toxicity and symptoms quickly. So for ethanol, it's really symptomatic care. There's no antidote available. Some of the symptoms include hypoglycemia, dehydration, vomiting, electrolyte abnormalities, seizures, and agitation. So I do just want to point out, these are calls to the poison center. We don't know how many of these ended up in hospitalizations or EMS calls. So for example, the next category, cream, lotion, makeup. I don't have any more information on the severity of those calls, but it's quite possible that, concerned parents or family members may, make these phone calls, but not end up actually needing to go to the hospital or call 911. So some of these categories may not seem very toxic. The next category of calls to the poison center was for cleaning substances. And here we can see almost a quarter of those calls were about bleach. So again, not super surprising, right? We know that sodium hypochlorite is really toxic. So it's an oxidizer and it has a really high pH. So toxicity there is mostly due to how corrosive it is, especially when bleach comes in contact with mucous membranes and skin. Really the pathway of most concern is ingestion. So people could have dermal irritation, and inhalation can cause some respiratory irritation as well. But ingestion is really where you see the most severe health outcomes. So you can have corrosive GI injury and systemic effects, which might include metabolic acidosis, hypernatremia, hyperchloremia. Not surprising to see higher sodium and chloride levels when a lot of bleach is ingested. So no antidote for bleach. This is usually symptom-directed care. Okay, on to the next category. So this is plants. The largest percentage of calls about plants were due to unknown toxic or unknown if toxic. That's that blue portion. So it's a little bit hard to, to get information about what that might be. But the purple piece of the pie represents calls about plants that contain amygdalin. And another word, or another way to think about amygdalin, are the cyanogenic glycosides. So this is a chemical that's naturally occurring in the seeds and pits of peaches, apricots, pears, plums, apples. And amygdalin gets metabolized to create hydrogen cyanide. And we all know that cyanide is a pretty potent poison. The symptoms can include nausea, vomiting, lethargy, and seizure. There are cyanide antidotes available, which can be helpful. There was a report out by the European Food Safety Association, I think in the past couple of years, that looked at how much of a seed or pit someone needed to eat. And they found that for apricot, so raw apricot pits, a toddler would only need to eat about half of an apricot seed in order to exceed the safe dose for amygdalin. One thing to note is that the seed has to be ground up. So if a child does manage to swallow a pit whole and not choke, they may be less vulnerable, or you may not see the metabolism because that seed hasn't been ground up enough to release the amygdalin and then cyanide as well. And another category that we saw from the Poison Center data were pesticides. And I'm going to talk a bit more about pesticides in a few slides. But we can see here that over a quarter of the calls were about a pesticide category called pyrethroids. And this is a pretty common category of pesticides. These are based on the chemical structure of a naturally occurring insecticide in the chrysanthemum plant. But we'll come back to pesticides with more information in a few minutes. The last category I'm going to share here from the New England Poison Center data, these are calls for fumes, gases, and vapors. And again, not surprising, over half these calls are for carbon monoxide. We all know that carbon monoxide is a very dangerous gas to be exposed to. It's odorless, colorless. It binds hemoglobin over 200 times stronger than oxygen. So it results in hypoxia, cell damage, and death. The symptoms can be somewhat nonspecific. And that's one of the challenges, or it can be one of the challenges with identifying carbon monoxide exposure. So the symptoms can begin as confusion, restlessness, headaches, nausea, fatigue, and drowsiness. And importantly, these symptoms will usually get better when people are moved outside. And again, going back to the theme of children being more susceptible than adults, it's usually the children and the elderly that get sick first from carbon monoxide. So it definitely reinforces something that we all have probably heard, is that we need to have our working carbon monoxide detectors in our homes. So I want to show you some of the data that was provided from the Vermont EMS program. So they sent data from the incidents in Vermont from 2017 through, that should say 2021. Sorry about the title. So you can see that, roughly 60 to 70 calls in 2017 and 2018. Looks like those numbers dropped off a little bit in 2019, 2020, and 2021. These are only calls for chemicals and radiological incidents. So this isn't to say that the EMS calls went down in 2020. In fact, they may have gone up due to other, we all know COVID was quite severe for a lot of people. But the two categories that really stood out were carbon monoxide poisoning. So, again, you can see between 30 and 60 calls a year to Vermont EMS. The other category, which was, roughly the same number of calls as carbon monoxide, were inhalation of toxic gases, vapors, and chemicals. They weren't able to provide any more detail on what types of toxic gases and vapors. They also did record a handful of calls on poisonings each year from drugs, medications, and biological substances, as well as respiratory distress due to inhalation of chemicals. But the number of calls were less than 10 per year, and so those data were suppressed and not included here. I just want to pause and see, Joanne or Jen, if there's any questions in the chat that you want me to address right now.
There are not.
Okay, wonderful. Moving on a bit. So I've said this a couple of times, is that kids are not little adults. They have a lot of different behaviors that adults don't have. So one of them is hand to mouth. And, we've all seen kids pick up every single thing and put it in their mouth. And that is a way for kids to get a lot more dust, dirt, chemicals inside their body. In addition to that hand-to-mouth behavior, kids also eat, drink, and breathe more food, water, and air per body weight than adults. And so that gives kids a bigger dose of whatever chemical is in the food, water, or air than adults. So that explains why it's one of the reasons why kids can get much sicker than adults from exposure to toxic chemicals. Kids also have a more permeable blood-brain barrier. So of course, anytime you've got chemicals crossing the blood-brain barrier, we have concerns about people's health. Kids also have developing organs, and that can make them quite sensitive. Their liver is not fully functional for the first couple of years. So a chemical that may be metabolized by an adult and excreted very efficiently could build up in kids and prove to be toxic. And then, of course, since little children are still developing, their brains are still forming, they can be susceptible to chemicals that cause developmental toxicity. So these are things that they might be exposed to in their younger years, or even while their moms are pregnant, and those could have lifelong impacts on brain health. For the Northern New England Poison Center, about 40% of their calls are for children 0 to 5 years old. In the Vermont data, we saw a little bit less, so a lot less. Only about 7% of the calls were for children 0 to 11 years old. And I want to just take a minute to talk about one of the things that we saw in the Vermont EMS data, and that was inhalation of toxic gases, vapors, and fumes. One of the important tenets of toxicology is this acronym called ADME, and it's something that kind of dictates how chemicals move and impact a biological system. And when folks, in the drug development world are developing medicines for to be efficacious for treating diseases, they're guided by all these ADME principles to make a drug that's delivered to the right spot and has the right half-life and is effective. But for toxic chemicals, none of the, unfortunately, we can't design toxic chemicals to be, with these ADME principles in mind. So ADME refers to first absorption. So how does a chemical get into our bodies? So a chemical has to move across a membrane. Even when we swallow a chemical eventually into our stomach, it's still on the outside of our bodies. So at some point for that chemical to harm us, it does have to usually passively move through the membrane at some point. And that can be dictated by solubility and charge of the chemical. Distribution deals with how the chemical moves throughout our body. So once it gets in the bloodstream, where does it go? Some chemicals like to sequester themselves in a target organ. And so distribution can be different for different chemicals, and that can dictate toxicity. Metabolism. We know that the liver's main job is to metabolize chemicals, and they have some very special enzymes in their livers. Or livers have very special enzymes called cytochrome P450s that do this. Metabolism can either make chemicals more toxic, and I'll show you an example of that with some pesticides, or it can make a chemical less toxic. Finally, excretion. This deals with how chemicals move out of our body, and this has a lot to do with the kidney and how chemicals are absorbed or excreted and then reabsorbed through the different parts of the kidney. That's dictated mostly by the molecular weight, the size of the chemical, and the charge. The good thing about oral exposure to chemicals, so when you ingest a chemical and it goes into your stomach, it gets absorbed in your small intestines, the blood there goes directly to the liver. And so the liver takes care of what we call first pass metabolism. And so if the chemical is indeed metabolized to be less toxic, then you end up with a less toxic metabolite entering the systemic circulation. The concern for inhalation is that when a chemical is inhaled, it goes directly from the lungs into the bloodstream. And so the liver doesn't have a chance to break down or metabolize and reduce the toxicity of that chemical. So there's always a bit more concern when we're talking about inhalation exposure versus oral. So now I want to move on just to two sort of interesting plants that come up for us almost every year here in Vermont. One is false hellebore, and this picture here, if you've ever been out walking in the early spring, you've certainly seen it. It's one of the first green plants that comes up, and it's confused with wild ramps. So wild ramps are yummy and oniony and garlicky. False hellebore are not oniony or garlicky. So it's, people should be very concerned if they're out foraging for wild ramps and what they're picking doesn't have a very strong pungent smell. But these false hellebore have steroidal alkaloids in them, and they can cause some pretty severe consequences to heart health. And in fact, every year when we do a press release about this, we encourage people, if they've eaten false hellebore, to go to the hospital. We encourage them to to not manage their symptoms at home. So within a few hours, people can start to develop severe, sorry for the typo, nausea and vomiting, and then they can move on to a slowed heartbeat and a drop in blood pressure. They also have some other symptoms. In 2020, I think we had a lot of people at home with COVID being adventurous outside. We did have 25 cases, which was a pretty high number. That dropped in 2021 to 4 cases. Another one that we see quite a bit is poison parsnip. So parsnip is it's a great vegetable that people grow, but if it is allowed to go to seed and then come back year after year, it produces these very, very tall flowers. So what you see there, those stalks are probably 3 to 5 feet high. And their sap is phytophototoxic. So that means that it becomes toxic only in the presence of sunshine. And the sap can cause these very severe burns. And what we worry about there is that people can get infections if they're not properly treated. So this could be something that that you as providers out in the field may run across people who've been exposed. I'll just pause again to check to see any questions before we go into some pesticide toxicity.
Thanks, Sarah. Nope, you're all set.
Okay. So the first category of pesticides that I want to talk about are organophosphates. And so I've got the structure there if anybody really likes chemistry. These were introduced back in the 1950s. Some of the names may be familiar to folks: chlorpyrifos, acephate, diazinon. The chemical warfare agents are also modeled after organophosphates. That's VX, Soman. And that is because organophosphates are extremely toxic to humans. They're being phased out in many ways. So their use is going down, but the human toxicity is very, very significant. And that's because organophosphates inhibit a very important enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. And one of the problems with organophosphates is that there's no selectivity for insects versus mammals. So when pesticides are being designed, it's a beautiful design when you can come up with something that's exquisitely sensitive to the insect or the plant or the bug that you're trying to kill, but not very toxic to humans. And organophosphates have absolutely no selectivity. So they're just as toxic to humans as they are to insects. Organophosphates are an example of chemicals that get metabolized in the liver to become more toxic. There are antidotes available, so that is a good thing. Atropine and 2-PAM can be used for acute exposures when there are life-threatening symptoms. Just a schematic of how organophosphates work. So this is our neuromuscular junction here. So we have the black acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter being released, and it's being picked up on a muscle cell. So, muscles do important things, like they move our arms, and, our diaphragm is a muscle, so it keeps us alive and helps us to breathe. When that acetylcholine binds to the receptor, you have the muscle that tenses. The muscle is able to relax because acetylcholinesterase, the yellow star, hydrolyzes acetylcholine so that that signal stops. And when you have organophosphates in play, the organophosphates sweep away all of the acetylcholinesterase, and you get this buildup of acetylcholine at that neuromuscular junction. And so you end up with the muscle fatigue. There are a couple of different acronyms here for remembering the symptoms of acetylcholine esterase inhibition: sludge, salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, GI distress, and emesis. And dumbbells. So again, you've got lots of fluids, you've got lots of sweating, the pinpoint pupils, you've got fluid in the lungs. So these are some pretty severe symptoms. Organophosphates also are associated with chronic health effects. This is a little bit of data from a study done on chlorpyrifos, which is one of the most widely used organophosphates used on crops. And this was done in one of the Centers for Children's Environmental Health. These researchers looked at the amount of chlorpyrifos in cord blood, so that they were looking at how much chlorpyrifos children were exposed to while they were still developing inside their moms. So they were able to quantitate the prenatal exposure. And then the researchers followed these kids for, at this point, it was 7 years. And they looked at their neurodevelopmental scores. And there are these standardized tests that are used to measure these outcomes in kids. And what the researchers saw was that when the chlorpyrifos increased, they saw a decrease in working memory. So this is the black line that sort of shows you that as chlorpyrifos is increasing, on the x-axis, you see the working memory decreasing on the y-axis, and then the red is the standard error. So not only do we have concerns about acute exposure, but we have concerns for this chronic exposure as well. So neonicotinoids are a newer class of insecticides. These were developed in the 1990s, and as their name implies, they were developed based on modeling nicotine. And these are much better pesticides in terms of human health toxicity because they do provide more selectivity. So neonicotinoids are very potent on insects, and they're not very potent on humans. And that's because the insecticide has one part of the molecule that binds to a charged amino acid in the human nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. The insect nicotinic acetylcholine receptor does not have a charge on that amino acid. It has a 1 amino acid difference. And so it's a great example of a selective insecticide, so more favorable for humans. The toxicity is similar to acute nicotine poisoning, which is usually not fatal. There can be a number of different symptoms there. Something that's come up with neonicotinoids is that the formulations contain a solvent called N-methylpyrrolide, and that can cause a lot of GI corrosion. This is seen mostly in intentional ingestion of neonicotinoids. It doesn't happen so much in the US, but in other parts of the world, especially places where these neonicotinoids are used in a lot of rural farming communities, there's a lot of intentional ingestion of neonicotinoids. Unfortunately, these pesticides are associated with the loss of bees, so the use of neonicotinoids is also under scrutiny and has been reduced to protect bees. So the next class, these are the chemicals that I mentioned with the calls to the New England Poison Center. I think it was over 25% of the calls about pesticides were related to pyrethroids. And so pyrethroids have, in general, they have low mammalian toxicity, and that's because of our liver enzymes. And this is one of the examples where the liver is able to just break it down and excrete it very quickly. So before the chemical really has a chance to harm humans, it's moved out of our bodies. Of course, this may not be the case for children, especially the youngest children, since their bodies and their livers are not quite as robust as adult livers. Pyrethroids do target the voltage. Oh, yep, we have a question.
Yeah, we just have one question. Intentional ingestion for recreation or for self-harm?
For self-harm. Yep, good question. So the pyrethroids do target the voltage-dependent sodium channel. So they do have the potential for some, central nervous system effects. But again, this has to be a large amount of pyrethroids that get ingested. So the symptoms can include paralysis, paresthesia, tremor, and other central nervous system effects. Just a couple more classes of pesticides to run through. Both of these made an appearance in the poison control calls. Anticoagulants are pretty old school. This is what we all put out for our rat traps or mouse traps. These anticoagulants stop the synthesis of a blood clotting factor, and so the capillary permeability is increased, and the animals sort of slowly become susceptible to that. Accidental poisonings of kids have definitely been reported. So I think, there's been a lot of effort to, make these, to improve the packaging and such so that these aren't as accessible to kids. And then the last category that I want to go through is boric acid and borate salts. And this is also a pretty old school pesticide. It's been around since the 1940s. Pesticides often fall victim to resistance. So as insects are able to reproduce quite quickly, they can often change their DNA. They adapt so that they become resistant to many of the pesticides that I've talked with you about. And boric acid is one that they are not able to become resistant to. So in general, boric acid does have lower toxicity than other insecticides, but occasionally the powders do become accessible to kids. And then you can have GI, I think it's mostly GI effects when boric acid is ingested. Okay, so I'm going to move on. There are two pretty large-scale chemical incidents in Vermont that I'm going to go over. Do think about if you have, if there was a chemical or a poison that I didn't mention that you think is significant, please do pop it in the chat. Because after these two incidents, we'll have some time for discussions. So in 2013, there was a misuse of chlorpyrifos, and this is the organophosphate that I showed you some information about earlier in terms of having the potential to damage children's brain development. A certified pesticide applicator illegally used chlorpyrifos inside. So chlorpyrifos is great at killing things, but it was not allowed by the EPA to be used inside. So the health department and the Agency of Agriculture launched an investigation to find these residences that had been used or where chlorpyrifos had been used illegally indoors. Starting in the spring of 2013, this pesticide applicator treated a home for bed bugs. When the owners came in, they saw pesticide literally dripping from the walls, and it was a very bad smell. And so luckily they did call the Agency of Agriculture, and the Agency of Agriculture regulates pesticides, and they gathered the receipts, which is supposed to be the official record of what was applied. And according to the receipts, the pesticide was a pyrethroid, but when the Agency of Agriculture did a lab sample, they saw a strange peak in their detection, and they were able to figure out that it was chlorpyrifos. So this was a pretty big deal to have chlorpyrifos used indoors. The health department was asked to develop action levels. So whenever there's a chemical incident in Vermont where hazmat they are the first responders in terms of like protecting people from acute hazards, and the health department is often asked to weigh in on any sort of chronic or effects on more sensitive populations. So we first, we had to remind ourselves what we knew about chlorpyrifos, and as I've mentioned before, chlorpyrifos is an organophosphate, which is a very toxic pesticide. We have concern for both acute and chronic exposure. And we asked ourselves, had organophosphate misuse ever happened anywhere else in the country? What could we learn from these other cases? And so very quickly, we found some literature on a different organophosphate called methylparathion. It's pretty similar. It works the same way as chlorpyrifos, but it had been used indoors in the states listed here, mostly in the South, because it was being used to control cockroaches. Those locations all became Superfund sites, which are the federal designation for the most toxic contaminated sites in the country. In the cases in Mississippi, there were 2 fatalities, and that was because and I think that they were kids. I think they were younger adults or kids. And that's because when the folks visited the emergency room, their symptoms of organophosphate poisoning were not recognized. And so they were sent home with mild flu-like symptoms. In the Ohio misuse case, there were 9,000 homes that were sampled and 1,000 that had to be professionally cleaned by EPA. And so all this quick literature search told us, like, holy cow, this is a really big deal that chlorpyrifos was used indoors. So I'm going to get into my little rabbit hole of what we do in my group. We do a lot of quantitative human health risk assessment. And so we were trying to answer the question, how do we interpret wipe samples from chlorpyrifos? So the Agency of Agriculture decided to go in and take a 10 by 10 square centimeter wipe. And so they would tape it off. If you've ever done a lead wipe sample, it's pretty similar. Tape it off and wipe the sample with a cotton ball soaked in ethanol. Then you put it in a tube and you run it in a machine, and you would come out with this level that you see on the left of how much chlorpyrifos, how many micrograms of chlorpyrifos in that square centimeter area. And so we did a lot of quantitative work to figure out what levels would correspond to those acute health effects, so those sludge and dumbbells type of symptoms. And then we also wanted to figure out what level on a wall would correspond to those concerning neurodevelopmental outcomes that we had seen published for children. And so those levels that we came out with there, you can see corresponded to those different types of health outcomes. And then we used those different ranges to provide advice to people. So we did recommend that people who had the highest levels of chlorpyrifos in their homes move out of their house within 2 days. And that's a pretty hard thing to tell somebody. So we worked really closely with the Rutland District Health Office, the Department of Children and Families, Environmental Conservation. We worked with Red Cross to have shelters for folks. And you can see as the levels on the walls go down, the actions became less severe, so to say. So as the levels got lower, we would say you should move out within a week. The lower ones, we said you should relocate sensitive populations, which included women who were pregnant or who may become pregnant. The way that we communicated these events to the healthcare community is that we sent out a health alert. So this is through our health alert network. This went out to Rutland County healthcare providers. I am pretty sure the EMS providers are included in all of those communications as well. But we wanted to notify the healthcare providers, just let them know that, chlorpyrifos had been misused, especially given some of the published reports of health effects being misdiagnosed in other states. We wanted to make sure that we were notifying as many people as we could that may come in contact with these folks. These are more details on the what happened after we developed action levels. So we did relocate some folks. I'm not going to go through all of this. Sorry, it's a little bit wordy. But many of the, about a third of all the bed bug jobs that this pesticide applicator did were positive for chlorpyrifos. And then we also found some of the non-bed bug jobs that were positive for chlorpyrifos. So that opened us up to sampling over 200 additional homes. So I think in total, over 300 homes were sampled. We did ask the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's emergency response group, to come in and help us with that because the scope was just really large. The people who were willing to be sampled were sampled, and then EPA ended up cleaning, remediating 14 homes. And since chlorpyrifos is a lipid soluble chemical, anything that was porous, which even includes sheetrock, brick, had to be taken out. So when we say remediate homes, some of these homes were basically stripped down to the frames and rebuilt. We did a little bit of work on assessing exposure. So there are a couple different ways to biomonitor for chlorpyrifos and other organophosphate exposure. One is to look at a urine metabolite. As we've talked about, the liver can break down chemicals. The liver breaks down chlorpyrifos to make trichloroperidinol. Fortunately, it is a specific metabolite of chlorpyrifos. And so that could be used to really show us exposure in the past few days. But chlorpyrifos is allowed to be used on our food. So we do have a little bit of background exposure from food. Blood cholinesterase can also be a marker of how much organophosphate you've been exposed to. And that's a fascinating story in itself, why your red blood cells need to have the enzyme that breaks down a neurotransmitter is, a puzzle that I never solved in grad school. But that type of monitoring only works if you know a baseline before you've been exposed. And so that's pretty common for workers who are using organophosphates, but it's not a tool that we used in this misuse case. We did test urine for the chlorpyrifos metabolite and let people know their results. We also gave them a health questionnaire and asked them about their symptoms. And we did encourage people to follow up with their healthcare provider. There were a number of people who reported symptoms, and for a few people who had very obvious signs of organophosphate poisoning, we followed up directly with the healthcare providers. It made quite a news splash. So if anyone was around back in 2013, you might remember seeing some of those news articles. So I will just have a few slides on my last chemical incident, and this was involving ricin. So this is a beautiful picture of a castor bean plant. These are ornamental plants that are found in landscaping across Vermont and in other places. We can start with the news headlines. This was in 2017. A woman made ricin at her home and tried to poison her retirement community. So hazmat was called in. She had been picking the castor beans from the castor plant, which was on site at the retirement community. She had an extraction set up in her kitchen. So luckily it was very inefficient. So her attempt to grind castor beans and extract the ricin really just diluted the ricin that was in the castor beans, gratefully. But then she put it in the salad bar. So she added it several times. She did it once and nobody got sick. She did it a couple times, and some people were sick from that. Symptoms include vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea. There is no antidote for ricin, only supportive care. But ricin is a Category B bioterrorism agent, and so that meant the FBI was in town. It was a pretty big operation. So the health department moved into an incident command system, which you all are probably familiar with. It's how we manage some of our really large incidents that have the ability to overwhelm our normal staffing capacity. So we had multiple calls with the FBI, with the CDC Emergency Operations Center, multiple communications and health advisories for hospitals, et cetera, just to let everyone know that this poison had been distributed. Our EPI group did a lot of surveillance. So they were looking at the EMS data. So EMS data is really like a real-time data source, just looking to see how many people were reporting these ricin symptoms. Within 24 hours, incidents are reported through that, or the ESSENS, which is the emergency room data. So they looked for anything with symptoms consistent with exposure to ricin. Luckily, they did not find anything. The EPI team also reviewed death certificates from the retirement home. There were 5 deaths around the time that the ricin was put in the salad bar. Those were all unrelated, so they were not due to ricin. And then within the retirement community, they looked at their health center records. So they looked to see if they had an increase in reports of residents feeling nauseous or vomiting. And they looked at employee absenteeism for the same question. They did not find anything there. So overall, it didn't seem to be as widespread as it could have been. And then in our environmental health group, we were charged with coming up with a ricin decontamination procedure. So one of the things that the FBI did is they tested many rooms in the in the retirement community for ricin. They tested the apartment where the woman lived, and they tested the dining room, the carpet, the chairs. So we ended up getting all this data with different levels of ricin, and we had to, learn from other experiences. Something similar had happened in Colorado, but we worked closely with EPA and CDC to come up with best practices for decontaminating the facilities for ricin. Okay, so just to wrap up, seems like you can expect maybe some carbon monoxide, some ethanol, some bleach, and everything else could be completely unexpected. Look out for the HANS. That is the way that we communicate with our healthcare community. And I just want to thank the folks who provided the data that I showed you. So Colin from the Northern New England Poison Center and Beth from our health department. So I'm happy to take questions or hear about any chemical that you have questions on that maybe you think I missed. I have the chat open. I don't see any questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We placed the session evaluation link in the chat for those that might need to drop off, but for those that are staying, we're welcome to take your questions. So you can feel free to unmute yourself if you like, or you can place your questions in the chat.
Any comments on industrial chemicals at some of our food producers around the state? Things to look out for. Yeah, probably ammonia might be one of the most dangerous ones. I mean, it can be stored in a lot of facilities. Maybe not food production facilities, but I do know that that's one of the things that hazmat gets somewhat routine calls about, or storage of ammonia. Do you have a, you reread your question? Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, if you have a specific chemical, if you have another chemical in mind that's associated with food production, type it in, because I'm sure there's others that I'm not thinking of.
Sarah, this is Heather, the one that made the comment. I don't have anything specific. I just know between some of the cleaning agents and some of the ways that some of our foods are produced around the state, it wouldn't be unusual perhaps for us to get a call. So I don't have a specific question, just some knowledge that it's happened and it's out there and wondering how to prepare for it, I guess.
Yeah, some of the disinfectants that are used can be respiratory irritants. So the ones that come to mind are the quaternary, I'm blanking on what goes after quaternary. I guess the quaternary ammonia compounds, like they usually have the word quat somewhere in the ingredient, and those can be associated, especially if people already have asthma or any kind of previous breathing issues or breathing problems. Those can be sensitizers, especially when people are exposed to them day after day after day.
Any additional questions for Sarah? Please feel free to use the chat feature or unmute yourself.
I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about like how these exposures are identified and distinguished from other more routine illnesses. I know that's like a super general question, but if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, do you mean the chlorpyrifos and the ricin incidents, or just in general the poisonings
Or
and such?
sure, yeah, or even also just like the plant exposures and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think with plants, I guess I'll start with the false hellebore, which is, I think, fake. People call it fake ramps. People start to just feel really sick, and then when they call poison control, the first thing that poison control asks them is, "What have you eaten in the past 4 hours?" And especially if it's early spring, I think poison control is expecting these calls, and so they're, so if you're in Vermont, you're foraging and you've got these weird, heart symptoms going on. They'll ask people, did you eat wild ramps? Did they smell like onion garlic? I don't do any of that work myself. So I'm kind of speaking from what I think happens. With the chlorpyrifos case, that was really obvious, where the folks came home, they did call the person to have their home treated for bed bugs. And so they were expecting to have pesticides put in, but they weren't expecting to come home and have the walls dripping with pesticides. So that was a pretty good indicator. But, the laboratory, I think it was good that the laboratory took samples instead of just taking the applicator's word for it, that, looking at the receipts, it was pyrethroid, and they would have gone on thinking it was a pyrethroid exposure had they not done the chemistry work to identify, look for pyrethroids. But then it's funny that because the person mixed pyrethroids and organophosphates, it was kind of this special juice that he called it. So when the lab found pyrethroids, but also noticed some weird peaks on their chromatogram, they thought, okay, we need to figure out what else this is. So I think, it's good that the lab took that step. Yeah, and then I guess for the others where people have EMS calls, I think that the hardest one probably to tease out would be carbon monoxide. And that's something I've heard from lots of different people, is that it's, of course you say, do you have a carbon monoxide detector? Somebody's like, oh, sure I do. And, when in reality, they only have a smoke detector. People don't realize that the carbon monoxide detector is the bigger one, or they just assume it's working and it's not working. And especially because those symptoms are so much more general, I think that's probably the hardest one to, but that's also why medical professionals are so well trained, and I think they have a really tough job to have to tease out all these potential environmental exposures and really figure out what's causing people's symptoms.